Ooh, come on. Come on. Ooh, yeah. Live your dreams, live your dreams. Welcome. This is Queen Supreme, and you are on the Discover You podcast, where we keep it all the way about you and discovering you in a better place. Thank you so much for joining me on this wonderful Thursday as we cope with grief. I'm your host, Queen Supreme, and welcome to your new journey. We will not only learn how to cope with grief during the holidays, but I'll give you the stages of grief plus life after grief. When I get done with this episode, grief will be no more trouble for you. Live life to the fullest and always stay positive. No matter what they say, you can do anything. If you're going through hard times, keep your faith. You got to enjoy life. I'm your host, Queen Supreme, and we are on Discover You. And today's episode is Coping with Grief. Grief is something we all know too familiar about, and we all know what it feels like to lose a friend, a family member, a neighbor, even a coworker. It's never too late to get help. Sheshma MHSA National Hotline is free, confidential for 24/7, 365 a year. Treatment referrals and information services in English or Spanish for individuals, families facing mental or substance use disorder. You can also call them toll free 1-800-662-HELP, which is 4357. Coping with grief during the holidays is especially hard for many Americans. Coping with grief during the holidays is something that seems impossible. So with that being said, let's look at a couple of grief coping skills. When you're dealing with grief, many things seem to be in the back of your mind. Anger, sadness, frustration. But what you have to do is you have to not be alone. One thing you don't want to do is be alone during this time. So you have to tune into your grief and your emotions, as mentioned before. So what you have to do is look at some coping skills. Create a journal and write down how you feel during this process, as well as pray, meditation, whether you believe it or not, coloring, speaking to a counselor or a friend, but never be alone. Many times we want to be alone because we don't want to be a burden on some people, or maybe we don't know how to really figure out how we feel yet. So it's anger when we lose a loved one. But you can always practice positive affirmations, as well as do yoga, listen to music, take deep breaths, take a walk, get some fresh air. When you're coping with a grief during the holidays, it's best to not be alone. And now that you have some coping skills to deal with that, let's look at some stages of grief so you can know what to do and how you're feeling. According to healthline.com, grief is universal and many people tend to fall through these 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These stages were originally devised for people who were ill but have been adapted to coping with grief. So, like I said, grief is not just a death of a loved one. It could be a loss of a job or an end of a relationship or any other change that alternates your life in a split second. Grief is also very personal, and it's not neat. It's not accepted. It doesn't, follow any schedule, and that you don't know when it's coming. You may cry, become angry, withdraw. You may even feel empty. These things are not wrong. They're not unusual. So, with that being said, there is crisis support for many of Americans that may need help and get caught in one of these stages. Acceptance is the last stage, but denial is the first. And when you're in denial, you're overwhelmed with emotions. So you're not really responding to the strong and often sudden feeling of pretending that, that the loss or change didn't happen. Denying it gives you more time to gradually absorb what news has been brought to you. And as you move out of denial stages, you'll be confronted with a lot of sorrow and a lot of denial. Examples of denial stage will be a breakup or divorce, job loss, death or of a loved one, or a terminal illness disorder. Once you are going through this stage, of course, anger would be the next stage. And where denial may be considered a coping mechanism, well, anger is hiding many of the emotions and the pain that you carry. The anger may be redirected to other people, maybe the person who died, your ex, or your old boss. Anger may mask itself in many different feelings like bitter or resentment or even rage. And examples of anger would be, I hate him. He'll regret leaving me. A job loss. That was a terrible boss. I hope they fail. Or death or a loved one. If she cared for herself more, this wouldn't have happened. And a lot of people ask the question, where is God in this? And how dare does God let things happen? But God doesn't let things happen. It's universal that you go to heaven or hell, or you are on earth. That is the outcome of mostly every American. Stage 3 is bargaining. During the grief process, you're vulnerable, you're helpless, and intense emotions can always not let you look at the facts. So when you're trying to bargaining stage, some examples of the bargaining stage would be, if I only had spent more time with her, she would have stayed. If I only worked more weekends, they would have seen my personality that I can deliver to the company. If I only had called her that night, she wouldn't have been gone. If we only had gone to the doctor sooner, this would have stopped. But in these examples of bargaining stages, this is just getting you set up for stage 4, which is often depression, where anger and bargaining can feel very active. Depression is majority of Americans do turn to depression and in the early stages of loss because they're running from the emotion and they want to stay ahead. They want to stay ahead of their emotions without having to confront how they really feel. Examples of being depressed is that we all go on why do we all go on at all? I don't know how to go forward from here. What am I without her? My whole life comes at a terrible end. So it's kind of like it's do or die for you. It's like, yeah, I mean, I can't live anymore. You have unanswered questions and you want answers now. So with that being said, when you are in that stage, you have to get your coping skills. Call someone for some help. Pray. Get some fresh air, but don't be alone. When we return, we will look at acceptance, stage 5, all this and more on Discover You podcast. I'm your host, Queen Supreme. We'll be right back.
Don't let nobody tell you nothing else. Discover yourself. I know for a fact about loving me. All you gotta do is keep on lifting your energy. You got to love you. Discover yourself. No matter what go on in your life, discover yourself. Yeah. Discover yourself.
Thank you. If you're just now tuning in, this is Discover You podcast, where you come first and making a better you is what matters. I'm your host, Queen Supreme. And we're coping and talking about grief today and how to live with grief and how to cope with grief and how to have a better understanding about grief. When we last left off, we were talking about the stages of grief, and the stages of grief, we were on stage 5, which is acceptance. Now, acceptance is not going to be happy or uplifting stage, but it doesn't mean you can't move past the grief or the loss. However, you may need to accept things and understand things and how the life means now. You may feel very different in this stage, and you may expect a major change in your life. But let's look at some examples of being in the accepted stage. You have breakup or divorce. Ultimately, this was a healthy choice for me. I'll be able to find another job and move forward. I'm so fortunate. Acceptances of examples. You can see I have the opportunity to tie things up and make sure I get to do what I need to do in the final weeks and months of my life. So, with this being said, there is a way that you can move on past the grief, past the depression, but you have to accept things as well. I know for me, grief is a sore spot for me. I have a problem with grief and accepting grief. A loss of a job is very hard for me. A loss of a loved one is extremely hard for me. And I'm normally the last person in my family to actually know when someone has passed away. So I have to also work on my coping skills. And if I can work on them, so can you. There is a crisis support if you need immediate support, or if you're trying to find help from a friend, or you just want to explore services. Healthline.com has a crisis support page, and it's reaching out. They have suicide prevention resource guides. They have how to talk about suicide, and they have a suicide line for help. They have mental health crisis. This is a website for self-care, for your mind and your body, to focus on your life for your mental well-being. You can always do a lot of coping mechanisms. Always know that there's 8 reasons to live from a crisis counselor who has been there before. We don't want to sugarcoat anything and make it seem like this is a journey that will be cured or changed overnight. It's going to take work. But one thing about it, if you work on it, eventually you can overcome it. Let's talk about life after grief. Life after grief can be exciting, challenging, rewarded, accepting the process of a death, or knowing that people are in your life for just a season, and accepting that maybe another opportunity of a better choice will be for you. There's always something greater and better and bigger out there for you if you give yourself a chance to grieve and move on. I always tell myself that grief will never get me down, so I make sure I have my coping skills in order when it comes to grief. And when it comes to grief, like I said, you can always call that hotline, 1-800-662-HELP, 4357. English or Spanish 365, 24/7. I'm your host, Queen Supreme, and join me next week as we do a makeover for you. 10 tips of making over and staying made over and getting back out there in the dating scene from a divorce. I'm your host, Queen Supreme, and this is Discover You. And until next time, love each other, love yourself, and be kind.
Ooh.